Well, thanks, Jim. Can you guys all hear me well in the back? I'm not like overwhelming you. Well, thanks for having me. I kind of pitched this idea to Jim a while back, and I'm really excited to have this platform to talk to you about something that's near and dear to my heart, but as you all kind of know, I'm hoping that it's near and dear to your heart as well. So, since this is a talk about storytelling, I thought I'd start with one about me a little bit. So, if you would have told me a really long time ago that I would have ended up in agriculture, I would have told you you were nuts. I have always been inspired by stories, the power that they've had over me, and just kind of the power I've had being able to tell stories. Growing up, I was a super shy kid, so writing was my way to kind of interact and engage and communicate with people subsequently. So I went off to school, thought I was going to be an English major, thought I was going to be kind of the next great American writer. Turns out that didn't happen. And so I started in some of my liberal arts classes getting really interested in environmental science and, surprisingly enough, agriculture. And so I started to look around and started to see all these food documentaries, things like that, and I realized that stories about science and agriculture, how science was impacting agriculture and communities like I grew up in, weren't being told very well, riddled with misinformation, things like that. Long story short, I'm fortunate enough to be here today where I get to kind of talk about science, talk about the research that happens here in CFANS, and just try and help our researchers tell their story more broadly and do things like this. So that's pretty cool. So thanks for coming, thanks for hanging out. I wanted to provide some resources for you today as researchers, faculty members, students, staff, so that you guys can get started. But this also is a conversation primarily directed at scientists, but I think it will, I see a few staff members will be kind of useful for everyone involved. So I think we all know why we're here. Are you guys kind of pissed off? I kind of am about this. But I think it's a really unique and interesting opportunity for us as scientists, as a field, to take a look at science and realize that there's something wrong here. And there's something that we need to fix. And for me as a communicator, I think that age-old adage of, if you don't say it, someone else will, is kind of playing out its part right now. And so I want to provide you with tools today that help you get started and do those things more broadly, but I know you guys think this is important, otherwise you wouldn't be here, but the reality is it's a little bit daunting. How do you make your science accessible without dumbing it down? How can I get my message out there? And how do I actually receive outcomes that I want, knowing I only have so much time in the day? And you've probably had a bad experience in some way, shape, or form that's led you down this path. It might have been in news, it might have been with some sort of publication that's made you think, presenting science as narrative stories is just useless fluff, it undermines my work, it's over-exaggeratory, it's manipulative, and is this really going to accomplish my goals in the most effective way? So I know you guys probably have a lot of different perceptions about communications. Let's push that to the side a little bit, and I want to challenge you to think a little bit differently about science, communication, less about outputs, and more about receiving different outcomes, actually, from your work and from the targeted communications that you're doing. So my challenge today is that what you've asked me to do here today is talk about a field. When I gave this talk at our plant pathology conference, it'd be like talking about plant pathology as a field in 160 minutes. Because communications, just like plant pathology and some of the other fields you guys are involved in, is a science, it's a field of study, is an art. So I wanted to pull out some things that would help you kind of get started, get going, and get on the right track. And so we're going to break this up. We're going to do some exercises, some group facilitated discussion. I want to have a bunch of time at the end, so we're going to fly through for questions. So if you can hold your questions till the end, we'll have some really great discussion. But if you haven't already, there's exercise sheets that we're going to be walking through. One's by Jim and one's over here. If you haven't gotten one of those, we'll be going through those more broadly. So number one, and one of the things that I think is most important, listening to your audience so you can talk with and talk at. So many times I'm sitting in my office, I'm at our departmental coffee, researchers come up to me and they're super excited, which I'm really jazzed about. And they're like, Dylan, we got to tell this story, we got to create a press release, we got to do this, we got to do tell. I even hear some of our communicators say things like this. We've got to create a Snapchat because all the kids are on it. Drives me kind of crazy. But it's tell, and I want to tell people to stop. and to listen and to really take things into perspective of your audience members. Why? I think there's a huge proliferation of media. This isn't a surprise to any of us in the room. But because there's so many different things coming at you from so many different directions, having things that whoever your audience is interested in is really, really key. Think about all the things you're interested in, all the things that you get on the day-to-day. You might get, Science magazine, and you might not really read it. So you have to find ways to really target those messages to your audience's needs. Because if you know who your audience is, you know what platforms they're on, you know what things they're using to engage, you can know how to reach them. If you know how they talk about a topic, you can talk about it in a language that they understand. You can actually reach them. If you know what they want, you can find out the right way to frame your story. And people always ask me, Bill, how do I know this is a good story? How do I know this is a good story to tell? I always come back with, who's your audience? And if you know deep down what sparks that audience's interest, you can find a way to tell that great story, and you know what a good story is for that particular situation. And if your audience members know how their life is better as a result of the work you do, the information you're providing, that story that you have, really the possibilities for you to create outcomes that'll support your research, that might be catered around giving, the grants that you're writing, really the possibilities are endless. And this is something really big for me right now, is that communications really is conversation. We gotta remember that, time and time again, all the research that comes from communications, advertising, marketing, things like that says, if you can talk to your audience in a way that they feel that you are talking with them and not at them, you're gonna drive business outcomes. And what I like to tell some of our researchers is, you don't want to be just throwing messages out into the wind. Why would we throw out messages without data and insights from those people that we're trying to reach and with their opinion? And this is something that I think speaks a little bit to that idea of talking with and talking at. Some of you might know Kevin Folta. He's a faculty member at the University of Florida. Big biotechnology advocate and someone who's out in the community a lot talking about science and agriculture. And he's pretty good at it. But he talks about this. He says, I made the mistake that many scientists make. I was arrogant, speaking over their heads, and I buried them with information. What I was trying to do is make them feel better, but I actually made them feel a lot worse. And if I've learned anything over the last year and a half, it's that empathy is really key, and it's a really powerful communicative device to help us understand the world that we live in, help us understand others, and find different ways that we can effectively communicate with us. So keeping in mind your audience, empathizing with them, looking at it through their perspective, which we're going to talk a lot about today. So there's two different components to this idea of audience and audience recognition. There's this whole idea of who is my audience? I need to identify them, and understanding your audience. Who really is that audience member? And so we're going to talk a little bit about what I like to call natural fit audiences, so kind of the audiences that are a little bit path of least resistance. We're also going to talk about those audiences that are people that might not be as engaged with science more broadly, and we're going to talk about a few tactics here, but we're going to start with those kind of natural fit audiences. And I like to tell people, who realistically is going to be interested in your work, the outcomes of your work, the information that you provide, and to whom is that message most important. Pretty basic, but it's really something that I think that we all need to step back and think about. And I should take a step back. You can dive really, really deep into quantitative data, qualitative data about your audience, and that information, you can find it if you really want to, but you'll be really, really surprised how just getting out, having conversations with those particular audience members and getting some kind of vague, qualitative rapport, so to speak, can really, really be a great tool. And you'd be surprised what you can actually learn about your audience just by getting out and talking with people more broadly. But you can, as a lot of communications researchers do, really dive in and get some crazy amount of data about them. But really, once you've identified their audience, you want to look at things from their perspective. This is kind of a really deep dive, and you don't have to go this deep. We'll go through some kind of quick wins in a little bit. But really thinking about, what's your audience like, what do they dislike, what don't they care about, What are their values? What is their lifestyle and how does your work fit into it? What do they want to know? What needs aren't being met? And I think a big one is what might be their misconceptions about science, your work, the information you're providing, etc. And one that's even really, really difficult to answer today, but you can glean this a few different ways, is where and how did they receive information so you can actually reach them. And be specific. I hear this a lot working at the University of Minnesota. Said, who's your audience? It's everyone. I don't think you're going to be successful doing that. You're going to have a really, really difficult time, especially it might not be in your wheelhouse communications. It takes a really, really creative person to create some kind of overarching campaign or story that fits all of these different buckets. Excuse me. And then, with that proliferation of media, you're not an ad agency. It's outstandingly difficult to get that information in front of them because everybody is using this, that, and the other to get their information. And yes, you can get more broad. When I say more broad, I mean people that are not really engaged with science a lot, but keep in mind that it's going to be a lot more difficult of a fight for you. Think about customer acquisition cost. It might not make sense for a certain company to burn up a ton of advertising dollars for somebody to make one purchase. Think about that same thing as it revolves around your own human capital and time. You can do it, but it is going to be a lot more difficult fight for you. And then get obsessed with your audience. Get out there, talk. Some of you are already doing this. Some of you in the room are extension folks. Some of you engage with growers and people more broadly. But get obsessed with it. The great storytellers really were those who were interested in human nature, getting to understand people, and I think the great storytellers are great, great listeners. So this is an example. We took a dive. I just wanted to show you something that just looking from the perspective of your audience can create some really great outcomes. This is really simple. This is not necessarily science related, but it's something that I did. It was a deeper dive than you have to do, but we just wanted to learn a little bit more about our students and how we could reach them, see things from their perspective when they actually come to apply. This is one segment that we just kind of gleaned from a bunch of different data that we have. So we just, who are they? What do we know about them? Just to grab a few things out of here. Really one of the things that we pulled out is that these students that are interested in applying, sure they're interested in the overarching program, but a lot of those students are interested in a particular researcher, in a particular project, in a particular field. And so what we learned is that we actually didn't have that information on our website, and it's something that we're still working towards today, is who's looking for certain students in certain fields. And we just are trying to, long story short, we're trying to put this information, make it easily accessible for those people who are looking, and I think it's going to go a really long way. And also for me, if I can save faculty time on email inquiries, things like that, that's a win. And so just looking at it from the perspective of our audience, we could glean a few things, just things we weren't doing that we had, and positioning them in a particular location. So it's exercise time. So what I wanted to do today was provide a particular some research information from one of our faculty members, and to kind of build something based on what we know, and you guys can kind of see the process more broadly. I see Kristen's coming down, not to put you on blast, but if you haven't seen it, there's a sheet there that you guys can work through. And so we're going to work through ASHOK'S Chanda, who is an assistant professor in plant pathology. He specifically works on sugar beet pathogens. He's also an extension crop specialist. And so you'll see this same text on the very top of your paper there, so you can reference that throughout the day. A little bit about his research more broadly, you all can read, so I'm not going to. But let's take some time. Let's take 3 minutes and take a good look at his information there, and think about this question right here. Talk with your neighbor a little bit more broadly, and then we'll come back and you guys can share a little bit. and some of you might not, and there's a lot of you in this room that are plant pathologists, so feel free to, there's a lot of plant pathology expertise. Feel free to grab a neighbor. All right. I don't know if that was 3 minutes or not. I wasn't timing, but there's a bunch more stuff here that I want to get through. So lay it on me. What do you got? Anybody?
Beet farmers.
Beet farmers. Perfect. What else we got?
Sugar industry.
Love it.
People who live next to beet farmers.
For sure.
Other
Yeah.
scientists.
Yeah.
Private consultants and advisors.
I feel like you know a few of those. Yeah.
Potential students.
Sure. Anybody else? No? Well, thanks. We're going to focus in on one. Granted, it's the easiest one, but I want to, work through this more broadly. And so now, said beet farmers, you're the winner. No, you're all winners. So take some time. You don't have to answer both of these questions. Just kind of get the wheels turning a little bit. So what do those beet farmers, what do they want to know? What needs aren't being met more broadly? What might be their misconceptions about science, about this work that ASHOK is doing that you see on the page here, the information he may or may not be providing, etc. I'll give you 2 minutes, and I'll actually time this time.
They want to know all these migrations.
I would say they just want to know how to stop. I think you're right that they need to know more. But I think you want to know explaining his research and yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's integrating. But I think
All right, time is up. Time is up. What do you got? You can raise your hands too. Yeah.
I didn't specify what kind of diseases it might cause to plants.
Yeah.
What was that?
I didn't specify what kind of diseases it might cause to the plants.
Oh, so the actual disease itself, not just the pathogen?
I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
They'll want to know how they can use their research to increase sugar beet yields on field production.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think they might be more concerned about how this would actually impact them. Is it going to up their costs? Is it going to be hard to implement? Is it going to, create problems with their own way of working?
Yeah, I love that, especially tying it back to themselves. I think that's for sure. Yeah. Yeah, Deepak.
How does it look and how do we know whether it's there?
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Yeah. Rob?
Maybe field symptoms, the identification of symptoms
Mhm.
in the field, rather than the DNA based.
Yeah, for sure. Symptoms. One more. Who's got it? Yeah, Lauren.
How to prevent and treat?
Mm-hmm. All really great stuff. Thanks, guys. This one's a little bit more difficult, admittedly, but let's take a guess. I actually have some information that I kind of got from ASHOK about how he perceives people want to receive their information. Take a stab at it. I'll give you 60 seconds. Don't overthink it. Alrighty. There's a lot of you in the room, so I'm going to pick on the extension folks in the room. Lay it on me. Yeah, Michelle.
So we were talking about that farmers often believe what they see. So we talked about having either on-farm demonstrations, field days, research plots, and bringing the farmers out to see the different treatments, see the disease, the effect, and how they would identify it so they could real-time interact with it.
Yeah, that's great. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Probably a lot of face-to-face or some sort of form of personal communication. Like in my experience, a lot of farmers want to, like they're related doctors to something, so tell other people have done it around them. They're also the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
Available on the web, something that's easy to search and easy to access from their phone without downloading a different app. So that if they see something they think might be that in the field, they can easily find information to identify it.
Just curious, there's some extension communicators in here. What works well digitally? like a digital intervention for this kind of information?
Minnesota Crop News?
Yeah.
This audience is more like industry specific. They'll read things that are directly geared toward them in like an industry newsletter.
Sure.
They're less likely to be trolling Facebook or even Googling that much.
Yeah, thank you. So I should rephrase this. This isn't how I'd handle it per se, but I was just using some of the information that I had. I just broke it down really, really basically. Of course, farmers, what they want, you guys had some great examples, but in a nutshell, just information to better manage their diseases. And this was actually a misconception that ASHOK came up with for me. Essentially, at the end of the day, just some misconceptions about the pathogen, how it is in the field, and how actually his research and some of the things coming out of his program is applied and shows some of these different kinds of information that they might not think is true. So there's clearly some misconceptions about the pathogen and how it interacts in the environment. And then a lot of the things that you guys mentioned. ASHOK uses Twitter to show things in the field and to provide that kind of up-to-date, how are things progressing. This crop news is kind of the big one. And then as you mentioned, the field days face-to-face is something that's really, really core. So you can see how just taking small amounts of information that you can kind of think of in your head, you can kind of start to build this picture about maybe how you might try to overcome some of those misconceptions with research-based information and your story. So number 2, we're getting there, and we're going to fly through these. This is something I've been really, really big on lately, is giving the audience something that they want and finding ways to promote through providing them actual utility. I stole this from one of my professor's slide decks, but I love it. Nobody wakes up and wants to be sold to in the morning. Nobody wants you to tell them how great they are. You come to different pieces of content because you feel like you're getting something out of it. And so I think the same rings true about university research. I struggle with this idea of here at the University of Minnesota we're the best, like works. I don't think that works. So how can you provide ways to get utility for your audience members? And this is extreme, but while you want to promote the research, the science, the art that is involved with your science and that information that you have, your audience might want something a little bit different and have other needs. So you got to find that common ground. And what we've done so far is we've started to build out this section, this yellow section. And we're going to talk a little bit more later in the presentation about building that left-hand section. But what do you want? What info do you have to provide? What story do you have to tell? What's unique? And finding that overlap between what your audience wants, what they're interested in, some of those things that we just talked about, those misconceptions that they might have. Admittedly, it's a little bit kind of a chicken and an egg conversation, and you'll see how the flow seems kind of bizarre, but it's an iterative process, and I think if you're listening to your audience member, you can figure that out. So I wanted to walk through an example that we've done in plant pathology, and while it's not particularly dedicated towards research, there is a research component that we want to be communicating more broadly. So finding creative ways to talk about research, to talk about science to prospective students and actually to other audiences more broadly. So here in Plant Path, we're interested about promoting the field, the research of our students more broadly, and we want to recruit the best. And prospective students, like I mentioned before, they're interested in those particular research interests that they have. It might be a field of study, it might be a particular faculty member, and then that question of, is this really for me? If they're considering graduate school, they're probably pretty good students. They might have some decision anxiety because they've got a lot of offers. And they want to know about the quality of the program, quality of instruction, things like that, and also that never-ending culture fit. Is this for me? What's the student experience like? So we wanted to find a way to kind of fill all these buckets, and what we landed on is this series called My Plant Path, the Path to Plant Pathology. So plant pathology is a discovery field. I've only met one person since being hired here who grew up wanting to be a plant pathologist. So it's a little bit of a discovery field. So we just quite simply wanted to use this as a great lead-in device to some of the research that our students were doing and fill all those buckets. So we just quite simply have students on camera talking about how they got involved with plant pathology, what's great about plant pathology, and then we have some video content that does that, and we typically follow up with, a written article that we can at least start to talk more basically about the research and, keep them going down that pipeline to that research more broadly and really getting into the science there. And admittedly, like after I gave this presentation at APS, I was like, we need to include a link to their actual research once they've done their research so that students that really want to take a dive can do that. So we're iterating, we're learning ourselves more broadly. I'm gonna try and show this video so you can at least check it out. It's quick. And this is more the lead-in, the tie. Some of you have seen this.
I guess what I've taken away from this entire experience is that it's led me down a path that I wasn't expecting to go down. I came here to study horticulture and to grow plants, and now all I want to do is kill them and have what's wrong with them. When I applied for the job, I didn't even know what plant pathology was. I was doing my hort undergrad, and I just wanted a job having to do with plants. I actually applied to the office first, and I didn't get that job, so I applied to a plant pathology lab, and I came down here, and it was soybeans, and I was a little unsure about working with soybeans because I was focusing on organic vegetable production. But when I started working with it, I just kind of fell in love with it, and I really liked working with different fungal pathogens, and I really liked making the transfers and watching them grow. They're all really pretty. I've been working here for 3 years now, and it's basically been just like one long lab class where I'm constantly learning, I'm constantly doing research. I've been writing papers, I've been reading papers, and a lot of experimental design, and basically everything that you would get in a lab class, except for I'm here every day, for hours every day, and I'm learning a lot, and I want to keep doing it. I want to keep being involved in pathology, and I want to go back to school, and that's something that I did think that I wanted to do until I got involved with this. So I'm excited to go back and learn more about pathology.
So yes, it's a little bit fluffy, but it's a great way for us to lead in.
Extremely circuitous. I got a job my senior year.
Oh, there's Blake. Another one of those. Let's not stop it. All right. But it's a great way for us to at least, reach some of those audiences that are a little bit farther reaching on the science perspective. Another example, we won't watch this one, but it's a pretty simple example of how having a certain piece of information and just having a small nugget of information about your audience can lead to something that works really, really well for your program. Bob Blanchette and his lab, who's up there, you guys, they're working on a pathogen right now called heterobasidian root rot. Or the actual disease is heterobasidian, and basically it's a disease that's new to Minnesota and can potentially have some very large effects on the pine industry. And really, quite simply, wanted to have something for foresters to know more about the disease and how to manage it. They just, they don't know what they don't know yet. It's a new thing. So just knowing that, we just created some simple educational videos with the help of some of the folks in the room here. And it's a direct need. We've had some great, coverage. And views more broadly, and LCCMR, who actually funds some of the research, is interested in getting this in front of all legislators in Minnesota. So it's a great way to not only target an audience, get that information, but I think support your research program as well, which is kind of what we all want to do. And another way to think about it, those non-science audiences take something that they know, that they're interested in, and kind of flip it. It's that classic rhetoric of, did you know how it's made, behind the scenes, all those different kinds of things. These are, 2 examples of things that have happened. There's science behind this Honeycrisp and some of Linda Kinkle's work back there. Some things that you don't know about microbes. Once again, great ways to at least get people starting to think about the research that you're doing. So I didn't want to spend the entire time talking about storytelling itself, but I wanted to spend some time, because it's such a powerful device, talking about story. It brings people in, provides them with context, and it stays with them. Some of you are probably thinking, but shouldn't everything be a story? I don't think so. I don't buy that. I don't think that storytelling from a communication standpoint always gets you the desired outcomes for the desired situation. Not everybody's research is catered to a traditional story for many, many different reasons. This is a quote that I stole that I can't remember where it came from, one of the design podcasts I follow, and you can't cover up a bad idea with good design. You can't create this really amazing, beautiful prose for your story if it's not going to resonate with that audience. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? But, story is a really great device. Here's the emotional. Tell me the facts, I'll learn. Tell me the truth, I'll believe. But tell me a story, people will live in my heart forever. Yes, it's that fluffy emotional appeal, but there's a lot of really interesting research that's coming out of psychology, about people's cognition, about the way people are learning and engaging with this material. Research suggests that narratives are easier to comprehend and audiences find them more engaging than traditional logical scientific communication. If you want to learn more about this, there's tons of lit that's coming out right now about the narrative effect. So there is some science behind why you may or may not want to choose a narrative. And for me, narrative and story is about 2 things. It's about appeal and it's about context. It's about appealing to somebody in one way, shape, or form, and it's about providing context for your research and how it affects people. This, I later learned, is not true, this story, but I'll tell you it anyway because one of my professors told me it's a great way to talk about context. The story goes, there's this gentleman, he's sitting on the side of the road, he's holding up this sign, it says, "I am blind," he's begging for money. He's got no money in his cup, he's not receiving any money. I believe it's Jeff Ogilvy or George Ogilvy, he's a big copywriter in advertising, walks down the street, sees this man, grabs a Sharpie, and writes this on his sign. "It is spring, and I am blind." And the story, of course, goes that suddenly he has money in his job. Yes, it is fluffy, but I love this. It's simple. It provides context. It gets you thinking about all the things. You guys love plants, all the things that you love about spring. And this gentleman cannot do it. It's empathy. So it's a really great way to provide that context. And we're not going to talk about this today, but I've provided some resources that are on the QR code if you want to scan it later after today. This is a great way to think about context, but specifically in the idea of scope and temporality and time and how your research may fit into a larger story. That resource is in a link. It's called PIXAR in a Box. It's a really, really great, if you're really getting into storytelling, it's a really, really great resource to kind of dive deep on a lot of different things. But I wanted to talk about, what I typically use when we go out and, I might be prepping people for an interview, things like that. I try to get researchers to think about, what is the problem you're trying to solve, including the scope of that problem and any necessary background information. That scope, think about it in a way of like a storytelling kind of lit review in and of itself. How did we get here? What's new, or what's foundational research? Quite simply, how does research aim to solve those problems? Don't get caught up in the methodology. Think about, what are you actually doing? Then, what are the overall impacts of your work on ag, science, people, etc.? Be honest. Don't overdo it. That's one of my big pet peeves in storytelling. And then another good thing to ask yourself is what's unique about your work? What is that value prop? What's different about what you're doing? And then think about attention grabber. And I was talking with Susan earlier about how we could spend an entire time talking about attention grabbers, but we won't. But think about ways that you can grab people's attention. So since we're a little bit tight on time, I'm going to walk through a ASHOK'S case and just kind of very, very simply think through, how, using this kind of framework, what might we think about telling that story? So quite simply, soil-borne diseases. That's the problem that he's aiming to solve. what's the scope? Minnesota, North Dakota, of course, big time sugar beet producers. And this particular pathogen, persists in the soil for many, many years, which makes it difficult to control. Farmers may or may not know that it is present until it actually affects, the plants. And for the farmer, the take home is, potential reduced yields. It's difficult for the industry itself as it might affect sugar quality, things like that. So providing that scope, that kind of historical information. And how are they solving it? One of the things that they're looking at is DNA detection and providing, resources for farmers to say, you have this disease before it actually shows up in the fields, and more classic research about understanding the biology and how the pathogen engages at the environmental level. And what are the impacts of his work? It's that direct research-based information that's going to help growers grow plants in the most effective way possible, and he's just trying to disseminate that research as an extension employee. And also talk about the value of integrated pest management, of course. And this is what, I actually did a video with ASHOK on this particular topic, and one of the ways I wanted to grab attention is he had this really great quote about integrated pest management and how, you can think about your hand. It's made up of 5 fingers, and your hand can do so much more with all 5 fingers, of course, than you can with 1 or 2 fingers. And the same thing, revolves around integrated pest management. If you're looking at it from multiple different angles, you can ultimately, be more successful. So that's how we took a stab at that, and I just wanted you to see how we can start constructing, a pretty simple idea about the rhetoric that we might take in a particular story to just kind of build. So let's take 3 minutes and fill out that framework that you see on your sheet using your work. All right, thanks for doing that. I'm going to fly through these slides in 10 minutes so that we have 15 minutes of questions. So, thanks. So really quickly, using that information about the scope that you've broken down, one of the devices that I try to use is it's kind of a Dylanism, but writing a foundation paragraph. It's kind of a foundation for knowing what story you have to tell and how you might tell it. Remember that Venn diagram? Think about this on that left side of that Venn diagram. And yes, this is something I do. Things get messy. We have to please a lot of different audiences, and this is actually something that I, kind of work on myself when I'm really struggling. Why write it? Think of it as an elevator speech meets a value prop. You can know what your baseline story is before you have to tell it, and it's a great way to kind of get started. And this is really just something for you to put to pen to paper, and it's something that you can iterate on. You can hammer it out in a few minutes and just kind of think about it as a great baseline to really line up all the dots and think about how you might talk about your research. And quite simply, you can see how a story might be told in building off that framework. Just write it out in a paragraph, hammer that thing out, and that's kind of your baseline for what story you might have to tell. And yes, this is something that I recently did around Corey Hirsch's work on plant phenotyping. And so, let's take a few minutes to find an approach that might work to communicate ASHOK'S story in this Venn diagram, given this. I just took the liberty of throwing a bunch of things up here so that you could see them all lining up. I'm interested in, if you guys have any ideas for how you might approach telling a story. It could be, an output. It could be, I'm just interested in what ideas you've got. Don't be shy, you guys can share. Michelle.
I'll say something, and I can honestly say this is something I struggle with a lot in Plant Path, is people know a lot about human diseases and how they get sick and people that they know are sick. And there are some parallels with how plants get sick and how we treat plant diseases versus how we treat diseases in people. But there's also some pretty big differences as well. So I don't know enough about what other pieces he's looking at, but depending on the analogies you could talk about, something along the lines of if you were to pick a similar treatment of either a vaccine that needed boosters throughout the season that would only cover you for part of a time. So the seed treatment is an initial treatment, and then, but it's not the only thing you do to keep your kids healthy. You would have to, also give them good nutrition and also do all these other things, and you could bring in the components of IPM from that if you're trying to cause parallels. But again, I always struggle with that one because it's not the same too.
How do you think you might actually, what might that look like if you took that device? Like, would it be, I don't know, a series of photos, a blog post? What would you think might work?
Actually, I would do an animation where you had a seed and maybe a colored orb around it, kind of to show its protection after certain weeks, and then you could have that sort of disintegrate over time and sort of show a progression, and then you could show kind of what happens when that's all that's done, and then maybe show what happens if, as that orb of protection is disintegrating, a new treatment was applied or different cultural practices were used. So you could make it very visual, because particularly when things are happening below ground, it's difficult for us to visualize the progression, and you've got microscopic organisms combined with something underground. It adds multiple layers of invisibility. So if you could illustrate that in even a pretty simple way, so people could have an image in their head of what's going on, like, oh yeah, this is breaking down.
Yeah, and I like that. I mean, talking about things on this left side with the disease and what we know about the disease, and maybe working in his work, and you're also, I mean, you led with the people think. Like, that's what I think that would be a really great way to potentially approach it. But yeah, anybody else who's got ideas? I saw a hand up there somewhere. Nope, I'm lying. All right.
Maybe showing the effects if they don't follow certain perceived treatments, what it look like, say, disease field versus health fields, and cause and effect in the end.
And that could be a really great lead-in, right? That could be a really great lead-in to more, full-fledged research-based information. Could be a nice eye catcher as well.
Experimental lots. I mean, like we had field days and other stuff.
Yeah.
We have experimental lots. Include that as a part of field.
Yeah, and I like a lot of these because when I took a look at this, I was thinking about a lot of similar things to you, something very, very visual that I keep thinking about this field days component, and is there a way that you can not only show this at a physical field day, but also you can get that kind of information out in a digital intervention, and what does that look like? And maybe it's an animation, maybe it's just capturing photos. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. Anybody else got any last ones? I've got a few more slides to get through. All right, moving on. Last one. If you don't take anything away from this talk, take this away. Be human, be social, because you're human after all, and authenticity resonates and builds trust. These are some slides that I stole from Edelman, who does the Trust Barometer in the United States. They compile a ton of data about trust from consumers and people more broadly. We're not going to dive too deep into this, but I just wanted to kind of prove some of my own points. Talking with and not at, that personal experience and data. Think about that. Think about how having a personal experience that might resonate over just showing data and showing that story might work more effectively. And this kind of shocked me, as you can imagine. But peers are now as credible as subject matter experts. So a person that you deem like yourself, a person that Dylan deems is like Dylan, is now as credible as a subject matter expert. That's kind of terrifying, but you can see the value of being human and being social in this particular context. And official sources suspect. This, as an institutional communicator, this is kind of where I need your help. Individuals more reliable than institutions. Very interesting stuff. And you can see that value of, this is kind of an approach that some of the larger universities are taking when I had some of their communicators talking about their strategy of being human. Ohio State is an institution that should not feel institutional. We are friendly, conversational, and down to earth on our social, just like the Ohio State University itself. And UW-Madison said its social institutional voice in 2 words: inspire goofiness. Which, as someone from Wisconsin, I get that. That makes sense with everything. No offense to anyone. And someone who I actually think does a really good job of this is our department head. He made me do this? No. But yeah, I think what really resonates with Jim's profile is you can look at his Twitter and it just makes a lot of sense. He talks about the issues that he cares about. He spreads the news about plant pathology, his love of flowers and gardening, you see him biking, and also just plant pathology more broadly. And I think this works really well. And me as an institutional communicator, I can leverage this, and I can leverage some of your social media accounts here in our department to really tell different stories. And when you're being human, being social, I just want people to think about what's unique about yourself, your story, and how can you capitalize on that. And that's pretty much it. I would just kind of ask you guys to kind of get out there, do it, start simple. And this is something that one of my professors talks about, when he thinks about brands, like where can you dominate? And really what that means to me is what's in your comfort zone, what's unique about you, what can you do that could actually make a difference. Maybe you're just somebody that likes to do photography in their spare time. There's a way that you can tell research stories through photography. Maybe you are good on social. Think about where you can make an impact and what's in your sweet spot and what's something that you can just get started on. And iterate. We do it all the time. Us communications professionals, we are not by any means perfect. It's always coming back to that data that the audience member is providing. So iterate. Put something just in front of somebody. If you're going for a farmer's audience, just get their opinion. Let them shoot some holes in it and iterate. And Jim and I were talking about this. Jim Bradine and I were talking about this. It's communications is kind of like an experiment. You kind of throw some informed noodles at the wall, and you see what sticks, and you throw some more, and just kind of see what happens. And ultimately, I think this is why a lot of you are here doing what you do. So thank you for everything that you do. I know how science impacts my daily life and the lives of others, and that's why I like to do what I do. But just keep that people component in mind, and that's really what communications is all about. That is all I got. We're going to be doing eventually some kind of continuing the conversation, so feel free if you have any other questions that don't get answered today to scan this QR code. You can submit some questions and we'll try to answer them in different ways. And follow us on social, Plant Pathology, and we'll be trying to do some more, continuing the conversation more broadly. Thanks.